Hey guys, it's Jennifer from the Clay Studio. I wanted to take some time today to talk about clay recycling. We had our weekly staff meeting today and we talked a lot about the things that were left behind in the studio, which means that when we all get back there, we're probably going to have some clay that's dried out a little bit more than we want. Which, if that's the case, then before I talk about the wedging styles of clay as promised, I want to address what you might have to do with some of that harder clay. In this bag, what I've got is some stiffer clay that just 15 minutes ago I tried to cut into with a wire tool, like this one, but I couldn't because the clay was too stiff. So I had to use the wire tool in my hands to kind of break up the clay, and I want to get it in small pieces so that I can spray it with water, cover it with some clay slip, whatever I've got to reintroduce moisture to it in a faster way. So it's in there, it's in small chunks, and though it looks like wet clay, it's really just very slimy on the outside, but that moisture hasn't worked its way into it. These small chunks are really hard to squeeze. So I'm going to make sure before I close this up that I maybe add a little bit more water. I'm going to get the air out of the bag. I want to wrap this up tight and maybe come back to it. 15 more minutes, I can probably open that again and reintroduce water. Whenever I feel like the clay has gotten enough water in it, I'm going to open up that bag and probably try and do a little wedging, or maybe one of the different techniques I'm going to show you here in a little bit, just to get that clay body moving again. Alright, so wedging. I've got my block of clay. I cut it off of a 25-pound bag, and I want to get ready to throw. Now, if you're a hand builder, then you don't really do a lot of wedging. The clay comes out of the bag, you're going to make it flat, and you kind of skip this. But as a potter on the wheel, we've got a wedge. We've got a wedge to get ourselves ready, to get our clay ready, to get things round. I think when we first learn how to throw on the pottery wheel, we're smacking clay into a little ball shape, and that's good. But until you start working clay on the wheel and building up scrap, you don't really have a need to wedge. And there are basically two ways to do that. The first one is how I was taught when I started clay in 2003, spiral wedging. I can't really tell you why my spiral ends up on the left side, but everybody else I know ends up with their spiral on the right. That's just how it happens. But I'm going to take my block of clay and I'm going to start pushing and turning. Now really quickly, you can see that spiral start to form. And spiral wedging is all about two things happening at the same time. My left hand, or for some it's your right, is really tapping and turning the end of this, while my right hand is pushing down and compressing that clay back together. The longer I wedge, the more smooth this seems to look. And we can see all this moisture that the table is sucking out of my clay. Now, if I was getting ready to throw from a fresh bag of clay and I went over, cut off a block and started wedging on a canvas table or a wood surface like this, my clay would be getting stiffer because the moisture is leaving it. So if you really like throwing with soft clay, I recommend either moistening the surface that you're wedging on before you start a little bit, or to wedge on a surface that isn't going to pull water out of your clay. I think I'm done. I loosen up my pressure. And this piece is pretty ready to go on the wheel. I know that made it look really easy. And you know, after so many years, wedging does become easy. I remember when I learned how to wedge, it took me like probably 2 months to really harness what it meant to wedge and to develop my own flow for that. So don't get frustrated, just keep trying, and pretty soon it's just going to come naturally to you. Now the other way of wedging is called ram's head wedging. So ram's head wedging involves both of your hands doing the same thing, just opposite from each other. and it's a more forward way of wedging. So I'm pushing out, and immediately this is the shape that I get. I lift up and I push out. And the clay isn't getting longer because I'm pushing it inward with the heels of my hands. You can see how they just come forward. If I hold this up to the side, you can see where that ram's head title comes from. Horns, face, pretty sweet. A downside to ram's head wedging is that you can't do this with a lot of clay. If I had a whole lot, I wouldn't really be able to push at this amount. So it's good for small, but if you're looking to wedge larger amounts of clay, you're definitely going to want to give spiral wedging a try. All right. So that's a good block of clay. Maybe I divide it. And I'm ready to throw. Okay, so wedging aside. Again, it's not a race. Don't feel like you have to wedge really fast. And there are plenty of videos out there in the world on YouTube for you to watch and learn about other people's wedging techniques. So, we wedge to prepare our clay for the wheel, but we also wedge to recycle our clay. If you're throwing on the wheel and something messes up, it might look something like that. Absolutely pitiful. And because this is so wet and slimy, I couldn't just start wedging this. What I might do, if I had the time and the material, I might lay this piece of pottery flat on a piece of plaster, which is what this big block is right here. In our clay studio, we have 6-inch and 12-inch plaster bats that travel around the studio and come to the wheel with you. I would flatten my piece of clay out on this, and the plaster is just going to suck the moisture out of the clay. Depends on how wet it is and how much clay you have, but very useful tool. If you don't feel like waiting, there's another technique that I'm going to show you. And it's essentially, as soon as this pot is wrecked, I just want to bring all this clay back together. And in the beginning, it's a bit squishy, which is fun, but I'm going to make it long. I'm going to fold over, and I'm going to keep folding and squeezing. This is essentially a way of wedging. Now, I'm not at all keeping air bubbles out of my clay, but I'm wedging the clay to get the moisture content more even. So after 4 or 5 passes, this is no longer slimy, and I can easily take this piece and wedge it. If I was to keep going with this, maybe this is a process that you enjoy, this would eventually stiffen up so much that I really would have a hard time squeezing through it. Even now, my hands are, getting a little bit tired. But, so I can take this, clean off my workspace, and just start up a little wedge. This is going to get the air out of it. I think this is a great technique. What I see a lot in the studio on the wheel is somebody throws a pot, they set it aside, and we end up with this really large plastic bag of failed pots. I don't recommend doing that. I like to get my immediate revenge on the pot that failed. So take it, squeeze it, wedge it, get it back on the wheel. Sometimes we might be needing to wedge or recycle clay as a hand builder. We roll a slab and we have all of these scraps that just, cover our workspace. Hopefully you're keeping them into a pile. Hope you can again, moisten that surface where you keep your scraps so that they're not continuing to dry out. while you wait to work with them. But that same technique I just showed you of squeezing all that clay together is going to work really well for those clay scraps. So if we leave all those clay scraps in small pieces, they're going to dry out really quick. So we got everything together. Do a little wedge. And we're good. Check on my plastic wrap one more time. All right. They still don't feel great, you guys. They really don't. And again, sometimes we don't want to wait for clay. So I'm going to show you a quick little technique. I'm not going to use all of it. Use some of it. But what I need for this technique is a wet washcloth and some water. And a mallet. All right. Put that clay under there. I'm going to get my aggression out. That felt good. All right, so my clay is still wet. It's flat. So I'm working out some of those stiffer chunks. Put some more moisture on this. And repeat. It's getting there. After only 2, it's feeling pretty good. All right, let's do it again. All right, that feels pretty good. I could probably wedge this. I might decide to keep going. All right. If you don't have a mallet, maybe you have a rolling pin that you can use and kind of take a, maybe not as hard of an approach with that rolling pin. Maybe you've got an actual hammer, a rubber mallet, a can of beans, whatever you got, guys. We're just looking for a way to pound out some of the harder areas of clay and get it to overlap and fold and mix with the wet stuff. Essentially, the flatter I get it before I moisten it and fold it, the better. Great. So now I've got, ooh, it's almost too slippery right there. I've got a piece of clay that I can wedge, and I got a pretty good workout doing it, right? Got some aggression out. This was fun. Whatever your clay goal is, guys, just remember to treat your clay with respect, keep it wet, and keep it wrapped. Happy recycling.